I'm strong enough for both of us, both of us, both of us, both of us. I am a giant. Stand up on my shoulders. Tell me what you see. 'Cause I am a giant. We'll be breaking boulders underneath our feet. I am, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am a giant. Oh, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am a giant. Don't hide your emotions. You can throw down your guard and feed from the notion we can be who we are. You taught me something, yeah. Freedom is out. It was you taught me living it. Togetherness, togetherness, togetherness. I am a giant. Stand up on my shoulders. Tell me what you see. 'Cause I am a giant. We'll be breaking boulders underneath our feet. I am, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am a giant. Oh, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am a giant.
I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt under me, yeah. I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt under me, yeah. I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt, yeah. I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt, yeah. I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt, yeah. I'm gonna shake, roll the weight in the dirt, yeah.
Good day, everyone. I'm Crosby Cromwell, the Chief Partnerships Officer for the Valuable 500. For an audio description, I'm coming to you from my apartment in Washington, D.C. I have long red hair, I'm wearing a pink dress today, and I have skin that always burns in the sun. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited that you're joining us for our first ever Smart Session, learning from leaders who've been there. These Smart Sessions will be a series of conversations, experiences, and explorations. It'll be a way for us to open source ideas to help you advance disability inclusion within your business. We know that this work is big and it takes time to drive change, especially change that is systemic. But you're not doing it alone. You are a part of the Valuable 500. This is a collective of amazing companies doing this work with intention. And we're all in this together. You've heard us talk about it before, especially Caroline, but our organization operates out of the ethos of intelligent magic. For us, what this means is aligning the head with the heart and building profitable and sustainable business systems that have empathy and equity built in from the outset. We've been hearing from so many of you as we're having our initial conversations, and we're loving these conversations, but that you're in the middle of designing your first ever inclusion strategies focused on disability, or you're building portions of existing plans and redesigning. So because we've been listening, that's the reason for today's session. To set the stage for a strong strategy, we believe that you need to incorporate 3 value principles. The first is to listen to your people. The second is to align the inclusion strategy to your business imperatives. And the third is that for any strategy to be successful and sustainable, it has to be leadership led. And that means at the highest levels of leadership. So we'll be talking about these 3 principles throughout the session. But first, we wanted to get a couple of housekeeping items out of the way. To ensure that we're fully accessible today, we have international sign available and captions in both English and Japanese. You can choose which stream you'd like to view using the labeled tabs. We want to hear from you as well, so please share your questions that you'd like to ask in Slido in the Q&A box, which can be found in the stream window below you. Our team will be answering questions in real time, so please note that we're only able to take questions in English in the English stream at this time. If you need to view a stream in another language and would like to ask a question, please email your question to Stefan LeBlois at valuable500.com. You'll find his email in the chat box now as well. Also, we're going to be inviting you to add your thoughts and your voice today to our session with a couple of live polls. I hope you saw the first one asking where you're joining us from today. So you'll see those throughout the session, and we'll be using those questions in the Slido tab as well. Okay, so that's all of the housekeeping we have. So let's move into the reason that we're here today. We have 4 incredible leaders. I think, yeah, we've got their images and their titles in front of you. Their bios speak for themselves. Joining us from Sky, which is also one of our 13 iconic companies, we have David Kerrigan, the Group Director of Diversity. Aidan Healy, CEO of Lexic, an organization specializing in neurodiversity and employment, is one of the Valuable 500 solution partners. Dominic King, Senior Principal from Accenture, will be opening us up in a moment with some new research. And last, but certainly not least, the phenomenal Peg Nichols, Senior Sales Director from Cisco. So I'm going to turn it over to Dom, who's going to guide us through some amazing new research that I had the privilege of hearing a bit ago from Accenture that will set the stage for our conversation. We'll be back with some questions after that. So Dom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Crosby. Let me just get my screen to share, and that we'll share in a moment. As Crosby said, this is research which is still relatively new in a relative white space. Really, not enough research has probably been done on disability inclusion. It was released in December 2020, so the end of last year, and was the 4th chapter in a series of research reports looking at underrepresented groups within the workforce. So we looked at gender, we looked at LGBT+, we looked at ethnic minorities, and we looked at disability. So I want to take you through the global story in brief. Before I do, I should have done a quick audio description. So I'm a 40-ish-year-old male coming to you from my study, which is adorned with pictures of my children's art, glasses, bit beardy, spiky hair, and a white greyish sort of jumper. I think American colleagues would probably call it a sweatshirt, but that sort of thing. Anyway, so sorry, back to the global story. So I'm going to take you through the global story in brief, and then dive into each of the data points within that in turn. So headline, and probably not news to anyone on this call, but I think it's important to ground ourselves in the reality. You know, persons with disabilities are about 15% of the world's population. Could be as high as 20%. You know, definitions vary across the world. So that's of everyone. Then you look at employment, and you see that of that 15 to 20% of people around the world, relatively few are in employment. So ranging from about 6.5% in China to 31% in the US. And even when folk with disabilities get into employment, they're much less likely to feel included within the workplace and much more likely to feel excluded within the workplace compared with colleagues. Now, I'll come on to explain how we define feeling included, excluded in a little while. But the point really here is that even when employees with disability get into the workforce, they're not typically thriving, certainly not the same level as their colleagues. And there's a couple of issues that our research uncovered. One is around transparency and one is around trust. So we find a lot of employees not being open about their disability, and similarly, executives with disabilities, a lot of them, these sort of people who could provide clear role models for other people, more junior colleagues, they're not being open about, fully transparent about their disability either. And a key part of the research, the thing we found was that there's a big trust gap, essentially, and there are clear and very strong and very good reasons why people don't want to be fully open about their disability in the workplace. So that all sounds a little bit negative, but there is a good news story to this, and that's that there are companies which are getting this right. They're getting disability inclusion right, and those type of organisations, which again I'll come on to explain how we define those. But that top 10%, that most equal group, where folk with disabilities are thriving. If all organisations were like that, then disability engagement, feelings of loyalty and productivity, feelings of belonging, all that good stuff would be about 50% higher, or 1.5 times higher. And they're often, when we're doing these types of studies, we do look at, there's a clear moral case, but then we do try and add in a commercial case as well, because not everyone is as bought in perhaps to the idea as many of those on the call will be. And what we found is that organizations getting this stuff right are not suffering for getting this stuff right. In fact, they're thriving. Those organizations getting this stuff right are growing sales and profits much faster than their competitors. And what we do, I think probably the key part of this research, and key for any organization looking to build disability inclusion within their operations, are these 8 actions, this blueprint for change that we outline. How do you better engage folk with disabilities in the workplace? So just diving into each of the those points in turn, we've seen this, but as I said, it could be higher than 15%, it could be 20%, but it's higher. We tend to see higher population engaged in higher income countries, and lower proportion of folk with disabilities in the workforce in lower income countries. And you see that big range there from about 6.5% in China through 25% in India, 31% in the US, and 53% in the UK. But even in the UK, which is doing very well by comparison, it's still just 53%, which is, let's look at that and say, turn it round, 47% not in employment. And that's the opportunity. And I suppose this is just to say that things have changed for everyone, or most people, vast majority, over the past 18 to 24 months with the pandemic. And that is as true for folk with disabilities as it is for other groups. And all this chart shows is really the proportion of folk with disabilities who felt confident in their job and their income generating potential, in the lighter sort of violet bars on the left hand side, compared with that was pre-pandemic, and then how they felt in the sort of this time last year when they were interviewed. We wouldn't have expected things to move too much. And what you see essentially is the bars on the left hand side are bigger than the bars on the right hand side. So folk with disabilities were feeling a lot more confident about their job and income security pre-pandemic than they do now. And that is as true for lots of underrepresented groups. It's as true for groups who are overrepresented in the workforce. But the drop for folk with disabilities has been particularly severe. I think here you look at the proportion who feel included, excluded within the workplace. So this is a question that we asked of all the people in this big survey of 6,000 employees with disabilities. We did 30,000 employees overall, which about 20% had disabilities. And we asked them this question about which of the following statements best describes how you feel in your team and organization. And you see the options they were given on the right hand side there. And that's how at Accenture we define this sense of inclusion. So the folk at the very top there who feel like a key component of their team with real influence over decisions, we would say that group feel fully included within the workforce. And what you see here is that top box is much higher on the left hand side than it is on the right hand side. So all employees about 26% feel fully included. For employees with disabilities, it's 19%. So in relative terms, that's a drop of about 27%. And you see how that is, counterbalanced at the bottom there with the proportion of employees with disabilities who feel excluded versus the all-employee average. So the point here is less likely to get into work, and then even when in work, less likely to thrive. And this is this point about transparency and trust I was talking about. So interesting to compare a couple of figures here. If you look at this figure, if you can see that 77% on the left-hand side. So that's the proportion of disabilities who say they have the freedom, or having the freedom, to be the same person at work as I am at home is very important in their working life. But compare that 77% to this 24% over here. So that's the proportion of employees with disabilities who are fully open about their disability within the workplace. So there's obviously a big gap here between the 77% who say they want to be open and 24% who actually are. Similarly, bottom figure here, this 71%, that's the proportion of employees with disabilities who feel that seeing people like themselves in senior leadership positions is important to them. However, only 20% of execs with disabilities are fully open about their disability. So again, a big gap there between the 71% who want to see these role models and the 20% who are actually out there being these role models. And I think you see some of this perception reality gap with this question as well. You see the proportion of execs on the top who believe that employees feel safe to do all these things on the left-hand side. And then the bar below is the proportion of employees with disabilities who feel the same thing. So do they feel safe to be open about their disability, about a neurological condition, to raise concerns about behavior? And on the whole, you see executives much more confident than employees with disabilities. And what that does is it weighs on the urgency of taking action. So, the message from this chart really is execs think their companies are doing pretty well. They're pretty good at providing the right environments in which their employees with disabilities, and indeed all employees, are safe to raise sensitive issues. But you ask employees with disabilities and you see it's not quite the case. There's a sort of a 20 percentage point gap on each of those measures. And you see that perhaps even more starkly here about why workplace culture is not changing as fast as we might like. You see here 67% of execs think that their organizations have all the right technology, the right environment, the right support in place to help folk with disabilities to thrive in the workplace. But when you ask employees themselves, that drops to 41%. And I think the figure on the right-hand side is perhaps even more concerning. So that is the proportion of employees with disabilities who agree with all these statements on the left-hand side. So 5 different statements. Now, you might say that's quite a high bar. Do they have to agree with all those statements? But if you look at them, I think there were things, they are things that you would say are crucial, fundamental to creating a disability inclusive working environment. Taking actions to help folk with disabilities progress, measuring progress, leaders being held accountable, being fully committed to hiring, retaining, and progressing, and being welcoming. And only 1 in 5 employees with disabilities say their organizations are getting this stuff right. So massive, massive potential to improve workplace culture. And that's what we looked at. We said, okay, so things headline level not going so well, but what can we learn from workplaces in which employees with disabilities do thrive? So as I said, we surveyed about 6,000 employees with disabilities in 28 different markets around the world. And we asked them about their levels of engagement with the work in the workplace. And that is things like career satisfaction, its aspirations, it's their sense of confidence and belonging, all that good stuff which makes people productive and loyal and helps them enjoy their roles. And then we said, okay, so we know what good engagement looks like. Now, what does the workplace look like in those types where people are thriving? And we assessed over 200 workplace culture factors, and I'll come on to explain a little bit what we mean there. But it's not soft, intangible stuff on the whole. It's actually pretty hard tangible stuff, because I think this is an issue with culture that comes up now time and time again. People say, oh, it's quite amorphous, it's difficult to change, it's how we do things. Culture, the way we define it, is not that. It's part of that, but that's really what happens after you put in place some of these tangible factors that actually make decide whether a culture is going to be inclusive or not. So we compared levels of engagement of disability of workers with disabilities, and we compared the workplaces that they're operating in. And we said, okay, what do the cultures look like? What do the workplaces look like where folk with disabilities are thriving? And you look at the top 10% of those workplaces, the environments in which those cultures are those strong, inclusive workplace cultures are most likely to be, and we call those the more equal or most equal workplace cultures. And then what we can do is compare those cultures where employees are thriving with the rest. So this is the blueprint I talked about. These are the 8 factors, workplace culture factors, that really make a difference. So when we modeled this, when we put it into our econometric model, we can basically understand what workplaces look like in which these employees with disabilities are thriving. And the 8 things you think here, I think that we can flick through them in turn, but you look at them and you think, wow, they're not very disability specific, right? And I think we hold that thought, and I think it's a very important part of the entire model, indeed of the entire argument here. So you think about role models. We've discussed that a bit before. We think about flexible working, the ability to have a duvet day, not come in some days, the ability to avoid commuting on some days we're not feeling 100% up to it. That sort of stuff's really important. Employee resource groups, that's perhaps one which is a bit more disability specific. Fair pay, we know that on the whole, employees with disabilities are not paid the same wage as other colleagues. Parental leave is important for all groups within the workplace. This freedom to innovate is a good one. It's perhaps one of the more intangible ones. But I think there it's about not boxing people in, saying, you have a disability, therefore you can't do X, you can't be given these tasks, you can't be given these stretch roles. Everyone, we pretty much found from other research we've done, about 95% of employees in the workplace want to be innovative, they want to be creative. So giving people the freedom to be able to do that. Mental well-being policies come up as strong, and then training which is available and relevant. So thinking about accessibility of training and making sure it's relevant to keeping skills up to date. And the next piece of analysis is essentially that it's the business case, and it's saying, so if you get all that stuff right in those environments in which all those 8 factors are present, top 10% of those organizations, what we see is levels of engagement would be 50% higher, career satisfaction and aspirations would be 2.3 times stronger, and sense of confidence and belonging would be 50% higher. So that's what the individuals are getting from these 8 culture factors. That's what folk with disabilities are sensing, feeling. That's the opportunity for organizations. And the other part of the opportunity is, of course, the commercial case for getting this stuff right. Now, not everyone loves this stuff, and I can't stand here and tell you that there is causality between getting those 8 culture factors in place and financial performance. However, if I told you that in organizations with better cultures, employees are more engaged, they're more loyal, they're more productive, they're more innovative, it's not a massive leap to say in those types of organizations where employees are doing better, those types of organizations are likely to be performing better. And what we see from our research is that the organizations led by execs focus on disability engagement, those who are getting the stuff, doing the stuff, building the cultures that employees with disabilities need, you see them growing profits 4 times faster and sales 3 times faster than their peers. So I'm going to pause there and welcome any questions anyone has.
Dominic, thank you so much for that and for the research, for talking through the opportunity, the profitability, and how universal design through these ideas means that you're making it a better workplace for individuals with disabilities as well as for the entire employee base. So I think we're just going to move into bringing our entire panel up to the screen and begin with our questions and conversation. But Dom, we will turn to you first. You've been presenting this research for a few months now. What do you feel like the general reaction is that you're hearing from the companies that you're presenting it to? And also, you know, if you ran the world, what would you want us to take from the findings or to leverage? What do you want us to walk away knowing?
Well, I'll keep it brief because I probably went a bit over with the presentation, but I think the reaction is largely positive. I think as you would expect, but I think it's of the 8 actions, I think a lot of people were surprised they weren't more disability focused. And I think there's a bigger point here around really when you create workplace cultures that serve different underrepresented groups, what you're actually doing is just creating better workplace cultures for everybody. All the research we've done suggests that this stuff works on the whole for all types of underrepresented groups, and it doesn't leave out, you know, the people who are in the majority. It doesn't disadvantage men, which is sometimes a criticism which is leveled at some of this stuff. It just levels the playing field, and that means boosting. Really, that means boosting everyone. And I think the other point I would just make is, don't let people, if I were the word, it'd be, don't let people say that culture is a barrier to change. You can change culture. Culture is not your logo. It's not how you do things around here. It can be much more than that. Those are symptoms, if you like, of what you put in place as an organization. All these things we've been talking about, the 8 factors and some, other things you can put in place. That is what your culture is based on. It's about what people say at the top of the organization. It's the policies and procedures you put in place, and then it's how the environment feels to people working there. So yes, it would be, those would be my two sort of takeaways.
Yeah, no, that's huge. Don't let culture be a barrier, but let culture be a catalyst. We'll take it from there. It's such a good point. Looking at our first polling question for a second, we're going to turn to our participants and get kind of a set point on where you are. So our first question, I think we're pulling it up now, is, does your company have a standalone strategy for disability inclusion? So yes is the first response. No, but working on it is the second. And no, we haven't gotten started. So I think we've got the chat online now. We'll come back to it if we're not able to pull it up. But the first question was looking at your standalone strategy. There we go, for disability inclusion. So we've got a lot of folks who are participating who already have their strategies in place, who are looking at ways to improve in it, to deepen it, to broaden it throughout the business. So David, Peg, Aiden, Dom, as we talk through it, knowing that that's where a lot of our audience may be, also know, but working on it. So let's go back into the questions and begin. We're going to turn to you, David and Peg. We want to spend this hour, like we said, learning from smart people who've already done this work throughout your businesses or in the process of doing this. So let's begin with the first value principle, which we talked about, which is learning from your people. So building on Dom's research, how do you include the voice of your employees at Sky and Cisco into your disability inclusion plan? So Peg, we'll start with you and then move to David.
Thank you, Crosby. So I am Peg Nichols. I am a 50-ish female, probably more on the ish than the 50. I am coming to you live from an equestrian farm in the beautiful mountains of North Georgia. I have auburn shoulder-length hair. I have skin like Crosby's that burns, and I have way more wrinkles than Crosby does. But I call those my badges of laughter. And it's just, I'm so excited to be here. So thank you for including me. At Cisco, we have probably one of the most safe cultures for employees to speak up than I've ever experienced. Formally, we have 29 inclusive communities that represent interests ranging from gender to race to people with disabilities, which I am a global lead for, one of the co-global leads. And these are organizations that are built like businesses with actionable outcomes. And so we represent the voice of our employees. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have these proximity endeavors where every leader at the company is tasked with sponsoring somebody who's different than them to again, raise the voice to the leadership. And then finally, and Crosby, I think this is a story that you enjoyed. We did a large presentation when we launched what we call CDAN, which is Cisco Disability Action Network. And we wanted to change CDAN to the Diversability Network. And we got such negative feedback around that. And as I shared earlier, when we put our egos aside, because we thought that was a pretty creative name, we're still learning. We heard from our employees that they didn't like that name at all. And so what we did is we ended up polling the entire organization, and we stuck with the Disability Action Network. So that's what we're doing at Cisco.
Yeah, Peg, no, it's such a great example. And the way that you all, we had talked about this story earlier, the way that you went back into conversation with your employee base with disabilities to understand why Diversability didn't work for them, to get to the root of it, to spend time in conversation and communication. So I think it is a great learning. But David, how about you from a Sky perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we take a really put a lot of emphasis on listening to our employees. We have the belief that kind of do nothing for us without us, and that really underpins our approach. So we're fortunate that we do have employee resource groups that give us an opportunity to elevate the voice of disabled employees, but really help shape the work that we do. Obviously, as the entertainment industry, our employees are also our consumers. So we work really hard to make sure that the products that we produce and the way that we not only go about our employment practices, but the things that we do externally are shaped specifically with the input from disabled people. So it's a great partnership that's not just an opportunity for people to form affinity groups, but also to help improve how we operate. Now, we also use our surveys to make sure that we're engaging with disabled people, and we do those regularly and break those down by different characteristics. So we're very quickly able to identify areas where our performance isn't as good as where we would like to be, but also to use the input of disabled people that we employ to actually shape the responses to some of those challenges. And the things that we do great, we use those groups to amplify them. The data that we hold is also incredibly important. We talk about listening to our employees, but also understanding where we are as a business. So the transparency that we can show gives people confidence in the disabled people community within our business. And 78% of our employees in the UK and Ireland, for example, that's 27,000 people, have provided information on disability. So we know that around 8% of those people who have disclosed are disabled employees, and that ranges from mental health to physical health, but it's a really great indicator in the trust that we've been able to engender.
I mean, David, that's phenomenal. So many companies are moving towards figuring out how to do that data collection and the ways to make internal teams, feel safe around why you're asking what you'll use the data for. 8% is a phenomenal number. We're starting to see numbers on the rise because the work has been done to get the messaging right from the outset. So I appreciate that. And Aidan, as one of our solution partners, building on what Peg and Dom and David have already added, there's a clear gap between leader perception and employee reality in the workplace. So what are the main causes, do you think, of some of these disconnects as you're working with employee bases, as you're working with your clients who are these companies? Aidan, we've got you on mute.
Sorry about that, Crosby. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'm a mostly fresh-faced young Irish man with blue eyes and blonde hair and full of hopes and dreams that I can change the world. And I guess one of our values in Lexic is empathy. And I know, Crosby, you spoke about building empathy in from the beginning. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit about empathy. And I think first, let's talk about leaders. And I think if you open the senior leadership team page in your organization and you look at the photos, it's very unlikely you're going to see someone with a physical or visible disability. And it's also unlikely you're going to see any mention of an invisible or hidden disability in their biographies. And I think if you think about it, how many times in your own life in the media have you seen disability as a positive thing? versus a burden for the disabled person, or a negative thing, or a inspiration that they have to overcome. So I think when you're in the majority, when you're privileged, the world is designed for you, it reflects you, and it understands you. It's a challenge for a leadership team to see or really feel, and I'm going to use the word feel because I'm a psychologist by background, that there's a barrier or problem. And so that leadership team often doesn't understand what it's like for a 21-year-old with a disability to join a system that isn't designed for them, that shames them for being who they are, or when they speak up for their needs, their experiences, they're often subtly or not so subtly told, you're a challenge, you're not a culture fit. And so I think also if you're a person challenging that system, Dominic, you talked about confidence, you know, the stakes are your home, your job, your income, your livelihood. So you hide yourself, you betray yourself, you become angry and frustrated. And I think we've seen some of that happen in other movements like the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, where leaders don't have that connection personally or professionally to the people who are not like them. I think a lot of our work in Lexic and as a partner is saying, okay, let's have that conversation with people who are not like you, and understand going into that conversation, you have to have empathy. You must learn and unlearn certain things, and you have to be humble. But what I would say for the employee resource groups is to have empathy for your leadership team, because it is an uncomfortable conversation. And let's be honest, most of those leadership teams are white men. And the message you get in the corporate world as a white man is don't appear weak, don't appear vulnerable. And to show vulnerability means you're going to get the crap kicked out of you. And so what we often say is just because your leadership team doesn't know about this, or maybe they've never engaged with it, or maybe they have a view that's ignorant to yours, doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean they're the enemy. And I think part of that process is really sitting both groups down and being willing to have an open and an uncomfortable conversation to try and bridge that gap. So yeah, I think we're human beings. Proximity breeds care, fear breeds fear. And I think there's a lot of distance between senior leaders and people with disabilities right now.
Aidan, thank you so much. And you know, it's what we're trying to do at such an intrinsic level, is to decrease that gap. It's why the Valuable 500 exists, to be leadership led. So I so appreciate all of your viewpoints. And it makes me realize that really for the beginning of the conversation, from that intelligent magic standpoint, we've been talking about the magic piece, the empathy piece, the emotion piece as leading a needing to lead a part of this. But when you look at the business side, I mean, Dom talked about in the research that when you're doing this, companies have better market share, have better profits, that there is the business side of the why in all of this. So Peg, if we look to you for, you know, our second principle, which is really where some of the heart of the business lies, with aligning your framework to your business imperatives. How are you thinking about that at Cisco, aligning it with who you all are as a company, along with the kind of culture that you want to have?
So Cisco's stated purpose is to power an inclusive future for all. That is our number one purpose. And in doing that, there are 3 corporate initiatives around corporate social responsibility that align to Cisco's business initiatives. And that is including, the first one is inclusive cultures, and that's attracting and developing diverse talent. It's also inclusive technology, providing secure technology accessible by all. And it's inclusive economies, and it's identifying those left behind in the digital economy and providing paths to prosperity. So I'm going to take each one of those individually and how we have aligned CDAN, our Cisco Disability Action Network, our ERO, to those 3 corporate initiatives. So our first pillar is talent. We have a leader there who is lining up with our Join and Connect team. And our goals there, our actionable goals, are engaging with specialized organizations to attract a pool of talent with people with disabilities, and to also write, accessible and customized job descriptions, as well as I mentioned proximity, and Aidan, I loved what you were saying about bridging that gap of understanding between someone, people that are different than you. So as our executives and our leadership team are doing these proximity meetings, we want to elevate people with disabilities as people that need sponsorship. So that's all around our talent pillar. Our second pillar is product accessibility, and our executive sponsor happens to be Jitu Patel, who leads up our collaboration business unit. And so we're working with Jitu, and he's assigned somebody in his organization to make sure that we set the standards for our collaboration products and how we provide accessibility. The third is community. And the first giant step, which I'm just so thrilled about, is joining and getting Chuck Robbins, our CEO, to sign the Valuable 500 commitment. But also down kind of at the network academy level. So Cisco has something called this Network Academy, and it provides education around Cisco certified technicians for security, cybersecurity. And so there's this Net Academy. We've served, I think the numbers are like 12.6 or 12.3 million people since its inception in 1997. And so we took an offshoot of that, and we're working with the Bridge Academy, which is specific for people with disabilities, attending for free these sessions. And through the work there, we have these graduates that are employed with our partners and at Cisco and at some of our customers. So those are kind of the three areas that we focus on with the Disability Action Network, as well as aligning to what Cisco's doing more broadly in the business world.
Got it, Peg. Thank you for the overview. And part of what you said leads to our next polling question I think we'll move to. And so that will come up on the screen as we shift from, there we go. So what are the biggest stumbling blocks for getting this right now for our participants when you're looking at setting your disability inclusion strategies within your company? So is it keeping leadership engaged and informed? We're seeing budget and resource pop up as the main, there we go. Needing external expertise. So keeping leadership engaged and informed. So we'll move back into the conversation and to the next question. So Dom, gonna look to you now, building on Peg's comments with your Accenture research and what you're seeing come out of your research and other pieces. Are there resources that you think that companies should understand or tap into prior to designing strategies, or that they should be using now to currently inform what they're redesigning? So when we just looked at that slide, budget and resource constraints are an issue. Keeping leadership engaged is an issue. So are there resources that can help with this process?
Budget is an interesting one. If you think back to the 8 factors that I showed on screen, the blueprint for change, how many of those actually cost serious money? You look at it, they don't. Role models, employee resource groups, maybe training, perhaps, but parental leave. I mean, at the margins, but we're not talking big bucks here in the grand scheme of things. I mean, if I was, the biggest resource really is your employees. It's to do what Aidan said to do. And it's great to hear that, David and Peg doing that stuff. Peg, I'm a massive fan of proximity meetings. I've spoken to colleagues of yours about those. I think they're an amazing idea that you're pioneering on. And it's understanding what employees want. Let me give you a couple of examples from the research. People we spoke to, not surveys, but actually spoke with. So one of them, a woman in Brazil who was not open about her disability because she was scared that she'd be made redundant if she was open and honest about her disability. So just imagine that for a second, and then imagine why you would keep it a secret and what that must mean for her day to day. Another individual, a bloke in the UK, was not open about his disability because he didn't want to be treated any differently from colleagues. He didn't want to go around with a sticker on his head saying, "Look at me, I've got a disability." He wanted accommodations to be there in place, available for him as and when he needed to. He didn't really want to have to go through a massive chain of saying, "Can I have this accommodation, this, and escalate it all the way to the top, and then some special, dispensation is given to me." He wants all those accommodations really to be available for him to tap into as and when He needs it without making a great song and dance about it. So I think, just two examples there of organization's greatest resource in any of this, which is just listening to your people. And I think, as I said, Dave and Peg give great examples of how organizations can do this. And it's start not only listening, but starting conversation, breaking taboos. Disability remains taboo in the workplace too often, for as we said, for good reasons, and then for just historical reasons. But the more we can talk about these sort of things openly, honestly, hope is some of those taboos get broken, and people can, be treated as individuals like anyone else, with all their faults and fables and everything that makes people who they are.
Yeah, no, Dom, thank you. So that's one of the points I think for the session. It's incredibly powerful what you just said. Listening doesn't cost you anything, but it builds so much in return. So, I think that's one of the things that we need to take away from today. But David, if we look to you, we know that Sky is a global leader in disability inclusion. I mentioned that you're one of our iconics, but at the same time, no journey of this kind is uneventful. It's not easy. We mentioned it's scary, it's big. What are some lessons that you've learned at Sky or in previous roles, or pitfalls to avoid as you develop and implement these kind of strategies? Help us, give us some insight.
Sure, and just by way of apologies, my audio description is I'm a 47-year-old mixed race male with no hair, more on my chin with a beard, and calling from my office in London. But as far as my experience, I've done this for 20 years now, and I've been at Sky just for 4 months. But having worked in government and other large corporations, I think there are some lessons that I've picked up along the way, which I think it will be quite helpful, and also touch on some of the things that Dom mentioned. So one of the biggest influences in my approach to this work has always been to try and change the mindset away from issues of accessibility, but thinking about design for all, designing the way that you recruit, the way that you develop, the way that you promote and utilize talent, and even in your products, thinking about good design. And I think that if that is integral to the very start of this work, it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't require you to do a huge amount of additional research. It's just about listening and thinking about what are the things that will increase accessibility for everybody. And I think good design really does epitomize that. And it is a mindset change. But I think when you talk about designing for all and moving away from just accessibility, it becomes a mainstream approach. And I think any design that doesn't meet the needs of millions of people is bad design, and I think that's a really important lesson. The second is to try and involve all groups in your work, and I think it's really critical that involving disabled people in decisions that affect them, whether it's through employment or your external activities, is critical, but be creative. And I think one of the things that I've seen work really well is that in numerous industries, they're driven by creativity, they're driven by innovation. People come together, solve problems, often without the expertise of the particular issue, but they create and they innovate. And I think with disability, sometimes there is a tendency to almost run out of ideas, to go to the tried and tested methods of working in this space without really challenging ourselves to do things differently. So certainly at Sky, one of the things that we do, which is really exciting, is that we say, let's come up with something that people haven't even thought about yet. Forget even implemented. Let's be really creative and challenge ourselves and bring a range of different ideas together to solve those problems. So I think those are two principles that I would say are really important lessons. As far as pitfalls, I've seen this in numerous organisations. It is about the fear of talking about disability. Often in my experience, the only people who are uncomfortable about talking about disability are people who aren't disabled people. And I think we've really got to get over that. Some of that is about fear of offence, fear of saying the wrong thing. But we have to accept that change will be challenging. And in some cases, the way that we talk about disability or diversity won't satisfy everyone. But it shouldn't be the thing that stops us moving forward. So I think my mantra is always the only limit, the only thing that will prevent organisations being more effective around disability is a commitment or a reluctance to do things differently, and it really just comes down to that working differently. So other things that are pitfalls, I think, are thinking that your learning is done. Again, something that has constantly been a challenge. You speak to one group of people, you think all of a sudden, for example, I've spoken to somebody who communicates in sign language, that's Steve, and because I've spoken to Steve, I'm now an expert on everything to do with the deaf community, and it doesn't work like that. We've really got to continue to listen, to continue to keep our ears to the ground, to make sure that new innovations don't pass us by. Because with anything to do with accessibility or technology, these things move so quickly. What you knew 6 months ago is a very different situation to where we are now. And I think that the 8 principles that Dom laid out in his research are fantastic, because this works for everybody, but it also enables disabled people to be involved and put at the center of that work.
Yeah, David, so agreed. Thank you for that. I mean, your points, as well as tying it back to Dom and the 8 principles. I also think one of the most important things you just said is that the strategies in some ways have to be living, breathing, moving things so that they're not outdated by the time that they're developed, and continually innovating. So I love that you all are doing those 2 pieces at Sky. And Aidan, building on what David just talked about, and you mentioned it earlier, that you lead, you talk about, you guide with this ethos of empathy, and something that you've talked about the uncomfortable edge. So tell us more about being okay with the uncomfortable edge as far as disability, or how you include that in your diversity strategies as you're thinking, as you're building these out, as you're working with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about empathy, it's very important we don't talk about empathy without truth, because empathy without truth often comes across as meaningless or platitudes, or the same kinds of things in the conversations we've all had before. So I think for us in Lexic, the first thing we will always say to our clients is, look, you pay us to tell you the truth, and we will try and do that in an empathetic way. I think some of the uncomfortable edge for many organizations is the conversations we're having are so often D&I conversations, or HR conversations, or medical adjustments conversations, or poor them conversations. And I think that so often leads us to questions of, there's no time, there's no resources, there's no budget, we can't get our senior leadership team engaged. A lot of our work in the beginning is actually saying to those enthusiastic employee resource groups, those enthusiastic HR professionals, that look, we've got to change how we talk about this if we want incredibly busy senior leaders in big global commercial companies to invest in this. This is not about charity anymore or compliance anymore. This has to be about talent and innovation and growth and brand and future talent and our customers. Otherwise, why would people change? And I think so often when people reach out to us, they say, oh, well, we want to do this because it's nice to do, because, it's an important, there's a moral thing to do. And I think for us, our uncomfortable edge is, look, I think there's a risk not to do it. This is 15% of the population. This is, such a big impact potentially on your organization. And I think what others have said, inclusion and disability is not about them. It's often about the organization. You don't have to have dyslexia to dislike a 35-page PDF saved in Arial 8 that you can't edit or adjust. You don't have to have ADHD to dislike 7 hours of back-to-back Zoom meetings. You don't have to have a disability, which I think we've all learned in the last 18 months, to actually quite enjoy and benefit from working from home. So this conversation cannot be about them over there anymore. It has to be about us as leaders, us as organizations. And when we include and we design for them, let's say, we actually benefit everybody. And that's business results. And so I think our uncomfortable edge is really shifting to that. So I am send me your I have no budget, my leadership team is not engaged. I very much welcome it. We're happy to help you figure it out.
I love that. You are a problem solver. You'll take, anything on.
Email me your challenges, Crosby. All of the 500. We're here to help.
Yeah, we're popping your address in the inbox right
Give
now.
Give my personal email in the chat. No problem.
Your home cell, your home address.
You said it. My Facebook page, my TikTok, everything. I'm available.
No, I love that. And this is such a dynamic group. We said it at the outset. You all know deeply what you're doing and you're driving within your businesses. We have, I know, time for just a couple more questions, but I'd love to open it up between the four of you. This work, we've mentioned a couple of times. It's big, it's scary. I've also been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen this much hope and this much optimism and this much movement. I've 100% drunk the Kool-Aid of the Valuable 500. It's why I'm here and I love what I do every day. But for the four of you, what are you seeing that scares you about this work and this particular time if we get it wrong? Or what is exciting you about what's ahead? Or one of each, just what you're thinking of. And I don't know, David, start with you, and then we can kind of, if anybody wants to jump in, add your thoughts.
I think for me that there's been, I don't know whether it's because of COVID, but there's been a real reckoning in society where people are starting to probably ask questions they've never had the time to really think and consider. So I think it's incredibly exciting that the issue of disability is again on the forefront of businesses' mind. This issue of the global community, it is a massive driver for change. And I think there's been a penny drop moment where, I think in the past people saw disability, I know most people had that view of a disabled person was somebody in a wheelchair. I think the conversations around mental health have done a lot to really educate people and also move us away from thinking that you have to be a registered person to be disabled. And in fact, the issue of impairment and life conditions is completely, I think, turned everything on its head. So it's a great opportunity. So the thing that really excites me is that we're in a position where people are moving to action. I think the case for making the need for disabled people to be involved has now gone. I think people are now saying, what do I do? And this is why these groups are so fantastic. So I love coming to these because I can steal with pride. If I hear someone with a great idea, it's great to be able to go and steal that and put it in the business. So that's the thing that really excites me. The thing that concerns me is as we've looked at disability, we sometimes talk about it in a very broad sense. So there is huge amount of diversity within disability. Some things have more affinity to the population, other things are more difficult. So they do require a different mindset and also a different way of working. And it's really important. The thing that frightens me is always the groups that sometimes get left behind. And I think it's critically important that we continue to accept and embrace the full diversity of disability, but make sure that we don't go for the low-hanging fruit, that we really do those things that make us work differently. So those are the two things from my perspective.
I'll jump in. The thing that scares me the most, first of all, I am so far over my skis on all of this. It isn't even funny. Coming into this was just a dream for me. And Dominic talked about those 8 foundational elements, and I'm so happy that Cisco has all of them. But the biggest fear is the time. It's not just money. We're resourced money-wise, but it's the time to spend to turn your strategy into actionable items and, maybe not go for the low-hanging fruit, but also not try to boil the ocean. So, one of my biggest fears is having enough time to actually help the company really action what we're trying to accomplish here and not just have it, stop at the strategy. So.
Aidan or Dom?
Thank you, Dom. I think what's the fear? I'm gonna stick on empathy on this one, because I think one of the things that fear I'm afraid of, and especially working with a lot of leadership teams on this, is you can correct your leadership team, you can challenge them when they're off, but you can do that in a way without condemning them and shaming them. And I think giving people sometimes just the benefit of the doubt can really be a big part of a process of positive change. I think one of the things I'm a little afraid of is in our enthusiasm and energy and excitement, we risk forcing things onto people, a certain language, a certain way of thinking, without really consulting them. And I think if we do that, and I think we've seen this in the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to get frustration, we're going to get rebellion, we're going to get pushback. So I think it's as David said, it's an incredible moment to change the world of work, the future of work. I just think we've got to have empathy for the people at the top of that chain trying to figure it out and not shame them.
All across the board, Aidan, right? There has to be a spirit of goodwill for everybody trying to make this change. Everybody, top to bottom.
So I'll jump in. My fear is that we're talking in an echo chamber, and I don't mean just today, but I would imagine that 99.5% of people on this call are absolutely convinced that disability inclusion is the right thing to do. I suppose the message for those individuals is don't just internalize all this stuff and say how great it was, is take it back out to the non-believers, right? And say, how do you change a few, if each of you could change a couple of hearts and minds, that would be ideal. I've been working in diversity research for 15 years. I haven't seen the needle on women in senior management move much in that time. And, some of these things, it's great to talk about. Everyone says, yes, really important, but then things don't get done. So that's my fear. But to counterbalance that, I think the ESG movement, so the environmental social governance movement, if you want to call it that, and especially the focus on the S, the social, is becoming increasingly important for investors and other, organizational stakeholders. And I think what we've seen in terms of executive compensation being tied to ESG metrics. So companies like Nike and MasterCard, Intel, Microsoft, they've all been doing this, tying what the organization achieves in terms of inclusion and diversity to what executives are being paid. I think is a really positive step forward for making this stuff very tangible and very real, and getting people behind it who perhaps aren't maybe fully convinced, but need to be.
Yeah, no, it's such a brilliant point, and stopping with those that we need to fully convince, those that we need to have involved in this conversation, getting out of the echo chamber. You all, the four of you, thank you for this hour. Thank you for your advice and your thoughts. The third pillar that we talked about, our third value, is making sure and ensuring this is leadership led. It's why the Valuable 500 exists, and we get to work with leaders like you every day. Thank you again for your time. We're going to close out with a video from the Valuable 500 about our 13 iconic companies and the work that they're doing within the collective. So we'll have sessions coming up. This will be sent to folks via email. Please let us know your thoughts in sessions you'd like going forward and ways that we can continue to engage. So Dom, David, Aidan, Peg, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, the Valuable 500 announces the 13 iconic leaders. They will play a fundamental role in rebuilding the business system to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. Here's what these global CEOs had to say about why driving the Valuable 500 agenda is so important to them. Dana Strong, Sky CEO.
As a person and as a leader, I wanted to make this commitment to help drive real change for people with disabilities. I want to help raise awareness and build advocacy to such an extent that disability inclusion becomes an essential part of every business. I believe we can create a level playing field for people with disabilities through inclusive products and services, and using our voice at Sky to drive positive change in society.
Carmine DeCibio, EY CEO.
The Valuable 500 is so important because it's convening 500 companies with the mission on inclusiveness, and in particular inclusiveness around disabilities. It's incredibly important that we will have 500 companies involved from different sectors, from different areas around the world, so we could all learn.
Hans Vestberg. Verizon CEO.
I believe the Valuable 500 is important because joining forces with other like-minded organizations will have a greater impact on driving and advancing disability inclusion. That's why we are proud to join the Valuable 500 to build a more connective, inclusive and equitable world.
Tim Davie, BBC Director General.
I believe the Valuable 500 is important because, quite simply, as businesses, as societies, we're not moving fast enough. There's a lot we can do as leaders within our own organisations, but there's so much more we can do together. My hope for the future of disability inclusion is a culture in which disabled people face no barriers, no obstacles to pursuing their career goals.
Kenshiro Yoshida, Sony Group CEO.
I made this commitment because I want the world to be inclusive. I believe fostering diverse human resources, inclusive of people with disabilities, will lead us to contribute to a healthy and sustainable society in the long run.
David Taylor, Procter & Gamble CEO.
The Valuable 500 is important because building an accessible and inclusive environment for all is not something any one company can achieve alone. My hope is to create a more accessible world through inclusive products, packaging, advertising, and environments where all people will feel included and valued.
David Schwimmer, LSEG CEO.
The Valuable 500 is important because disability just hasn't gotten the kind of attention and focus that it should have when it affects 17% of the world's population. Society's been making progress on race or ethnic issues. Society's been making progress on gender issues, but we haven't had the kind of focus on really improving inclusion for those with disabilities.
Sharon Thorne, Deloitte Global Board Chair.
Fairness and equity have been very important to me since childhood. I also believe that in order for organisations to access the best talent, they have to remove barriers, have to make people feel that they belong and are able to be themselves and participate fully.
Oliver Beta, Allianz CEO.
As a business leader, I would like to make this personal commitment because I really believe in diversity as an opportunity. I hope that the future of disability inclusion highlights one important point, that we don't talk about what people cannot do, but we talk about what we can do.
Anish Shah, MD and CEO, Mahindra Group.
My hope for the future is about ability and disability diversity, building and nurturing capabilities without any bias, to truly becoming inclusive, to recognize that we have ability and disability within all of us, to realize that we're human first, and to support each other to rise.